From the Toronto Star, I'm Sabah Itazaz, and this matters. Toronto's Sidewalk Labs might have started with a splash and ended with a splatter, but smart technology to run cities is a part of a future we cannot avoid. In fact, the smart cities of tomorrow are already here. Projections show that more than 2/3 of the world's population will be living in cities by 2050. And that means it's kind of important that our future cities aren't hellscapes, but instead smart urban centers with a dash of sci-fi film inspiration. Devices, roads, and lampposts all talking to each other. And this transformation is already beginning, bringing with it big questions about data and privacy and individual rights versus collective comfort. The Star's Atkinson Fellow, John Lorinc, has done an entire series delving into the depths of all that. He's with me today to talk about the potential of smart cities, whether Toronto will become one, and how the COVID-19 pandemic might have paved the way for this debate. John Lorinc is a writer and a senior editor for Spacing magazine who has written about cities a lot and for a long time. Hi, John. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Oh, you're welcome.
John, first of all, what exactly is a smart city? What are some of the features and technologies that make a city smarter than the next?
Well, the label is kind of amorphous. In the context of the series, I'm really talking about smart city technology, and it's a big family of technologies. They could be used in building systems, in transportation, in policing and law enforcement. And essentially, the notion of a smart city is that you have this deployment of different types of technologies that kind of capture what's going on in a city and can use that information to affect the way infrastructure works, the way transportation works, a whole range of sort of functional operations within the city.
And does sustainability also play a role?
Yeah, sustainability. Actually, one of the most compelling cases for smart city technology involves sustainable elements. And so in the series, I talk about some examples in the Netherlands, for example, where different types of technologies are being used to deal with extreme weather, with flooding, and with a range of other types of measures involving green energy and so on. So that's a big application.
And we're seeing a lot of rapidly changing events in the world. What are the challenges for a city of the future? Has this time during the pandemic sort of highlighted that in any way and shaped the debate on smart cities going forward? I mean, considering our reliance that we've seen on digital and wireless infrastructures during this time?
Yeah, this is a really good question because I started working on this series before the pandemic, and then the pandemic hit, and then I went back to a bunch of my sources and said, well, what about the pandemic? Like, how does that impact this, longer conversation? So there were a mix of views, but one of the things that really seems to have come out is that, to your point, that the increased reliance on digital technology and on, digital service delivery and all sorts of basically non-physical ways of interacting have increased so much, and they will affect the way the city works, the way people live in the city, the way they communicate. I mean, we wouldn't have done this a year ago. We would have done this podcast differently. And these are all changes that will leave their mark.
So in a way, the pandemic could be a driving force that sort of forces us to redesign our urban spaces.
I'm not sure I would go all the way to driving force, but it'll certainly accelerate certain kinds of processes that were underway already. Digital and information technology has been part of cities and municipal government for well over a generation. I see the curve kind of moving upward rapidly as a result of the pandemic.
In terms of Toronto's potential, what's the argument for Toronto to become a fully smart city? Is the real estate and sociological climate conducive to this becoming a reality in the future?
One of the conclusions that I came away from with the series is that, you have to really look at all of these technologies on their merits and individually and look at them critically, because in some cases they can really improve quality of life. They could reduce carbon. They could do a lot of good things. And in other cases, they can be misused or create a kind of a surveillance state, which I don't think anybody really wants. Somewhere in the series, I say that, talking about smart city technology is like talking about mammals, right? There's so many different types. And for Toronto to become a smart city, we have to critically engage with each of these different types of technologies, understand how they work together, understand their impact on us, and understand how they might be misused or used for purposes that they were never intended to.
And as you might have seen from what went down with Sidewalk Labs, public acceptance and participation is really important in this as well. I want to talk a little bit more about Sidewalk Labs. What happened there from splashy, rather controversial debut to pulling out in the middle of a pandemic? What happened there? And are there any lessons that we can take from that going forward if we are to get into a smart city development?
I think what happened is that here was this company, which was a sort of a blend of Silicon Valley tech and New York City real estate development. They had a big plan for part of the Portlands, and it was a very comprehensive plan. Most of your listeners will know the area in the Portlands doesn't have much on it. I mean, it's fallow industrial land. And they had this whole notion of building a very technically futuristic kind of neighborhood in that area that would have all of these kind of digital connections. And the way that Sidewalk promoted this was that it would solve a whole bunch of major urban problems in Toronto, the shortage of affordable housing, climate problems and so on. I think it was really oversold in many ways. And the other issue was that the technologies that they were proposing, some of them exist and used elsewhere, and some of them are quite speculative. It wasn't really all that easy to understand exactly what they were proposing, and they were not that clear about it. And I think that part of the backlash against Sidewalk had to do with the fact that there was this sort of a lack of clarity. And the other part is that I think a well-founded concern about privacy and about the surveillance societies and so on. We've given up our privacy rights in many, many domains. And I always say that I don't think anybody needs to know that I'm taking my dog for a walk. That information doesn't need to be tracked and monetized. And I think that we could ask the question whether these systems do that either deliberately or inadvertently.
We'll be right back. These are the sort of concerns and the sort of debate that comes up when we talk about this kind of technology. It came up during the Sidewalk Lab project as well. There's a lot of big brother type surveillance and privacy concerns, as you're speaking to. How do we balance that? How do we balance individual rights with smart, useful technology that could improve quality of life as well for many city dwellers? Is there a way to build a smart city without infringing on people's digital or privacy rights?
I think you have to disaggregate it. You can think about what Sidewalk Labs was proposing as if you walked up to the main door of a Loblaws and somebody handed you a full shopping cart and said, here's your groceries, and you didn't have any say in it at all. I think the better approach is for the city and the residents and, the public sector to identify specific problems and then say, okay, well, how do we address these problems, and can technology be brought to bear in that solution, and focus on that area, and then focus on the second area and the third area, and kind of tease it apart that way, as opposed to trying to sort of buy this giant package with all of these features that nobody can understand. And I think that that's the key to it. And then you get a better kind of engagement, and one that generates less backlash. I mean, part of the problem with the Sidewalk situation was that, there were positive elements to what they were proposing, but there was so much and there was so many concerns that it ended up being kind of binary, like either you liked it or you didn't like it. I think the better approach is to say, okay, well, let's think about how we deal with energy efficiency in condominium buildings, and how do we deal with finding new ways of delivering recreation services and so on, and do it that way instead.
So you're talking about a more community-based approach where first the problems are identified and then a community-based solution can be thought of as to how technology could help with that, right?
Yeah, exactly. It shouldn't be a tail wagging the dog scenario. And the Sidewalk was definitely a tail wagging the dog scenario.
And also people are worried that their information, other than the privacy rights, it will also just become a commodity to be owned by big tech. Is that a valid concern? And is there a way for smart cities to be developed from a human rights perspective as well, rather than just relying on tech giants and this capitalistic approach that often gets critiqued?
In my reporting, and I mean, this has been noted at many other places, there are places like Barcelona, there are sort of legislative regimes like the GDPR, which is the European Union's privacy laws, which are much better at kind of sort of ensuring that the arrow is pointing in the right direction, that it begins with people, it begins with sort of cities, and then you find the right tools and fit those in place, as opposed to, cities just, municipalities just going in half blind to very large and expensive technology procurements, and then discovering after the fact that there are these problems that they didn't anticipate. And privacy is one of them. But it's also there was a lot of concern about individuals, the surveillance of individuals. But the related issue is, if you aggregate up all these data points, right? There are X number of people who are crossing this street at a certain time. Is that information, can it be packaged up and sold to somebody and used in some way? And those are debates that we have to have. Maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. But I don't think that was properly discussed when we were considering the sidewalk proposal.
And you mentioned Barcelona. Are there other countries that are experimenting successfully with smart technology, keeping all of these privacy rights considerations and balancing that as well?
One of the places that's sort of held up as really an outstanding example is Estonia, which is an entire country. Estonia is a very small place, and its population is roughly the size of the city of Toronto. And they have a very robust system that kind of gets the best of both worlds, because it gets the convenience and the sort of the frictionless quality of digital services, but ensures privacy. It ensures that this information is not commodified and used in some other context. They call it Crossroads, cross being an X. So that's a system that's been developed in Estonia over a number of years. There are various examples. The city of Boston has a very sort of forward-looking approach to using smart technology. And then there are sort of counterexamples where there are jurisdictions that just kind of sort of welcomed it with open arms, these big smart city mega proposals, and they tend to be oversold and they underdeliver. So there's quite a range. But Barcelona is held up because it's very citizen driven. The issues begin with people and with Barcelona residents discerning what the issues are, and then they kind of look at the technology solutions second.
And John, is there a political and a governance aspect to this as well? How will cities eventually govern these systems with such powerful technologies on the horizon and more coming?
That's an excellent question, and it's a very difficult question. Governance is a topic that I deal with in the final installment of the series, and it takes a lot of different forms, right? People shouldn't be thinking that, city councillors will be making decisions about these very sort of difficult technologies. Governance means different types of regulation, new types of regulation. It means different types of professional ethics and professional certification. So there are a lot of elements to proper governance. Some of it has to do with provincial and federal legislation governing privacy and the use of data. But I mean, this is really one of the gifts that Sidewalk gave us, which is not usually acknowledged, is that it caused us to have this very broad and robust discussion about what was missing and what we needed. And I think that a lot of information and insight came out during their 2.5 years in Toronto. And we could use that going forward to get the best out of smart city technology without the risks of intrusion and excessive corporatization.
And when we talk about this, obviously the biggest thing on everybody's mind is data concerns. And since the pandemic, I was wondering if you've seen some kind of a shift in how we think about this. For example, data concerns might have shifted with the reality of COVID contact tracing. About 6 months ago, I would not be very okay with the idea of having my movements and interactions tracked if I was potentially COVID positive. Do you think there's some kind of shift happening in terms of how we think about this, which could lead to more smart city tech?
Yes, I think that's exactly what is happening. I think it's difficult to know whether it's permanent. People were scared. People are still scared about catching this disease and are saying, okay, well, what's more important to me, to be protected or to sort of uphold some abstract right about my own privacy? And the answer is easy. But I think one of the things that's interesting about what will happen in the post-pandemic world is whether some of these technologies will be repurposed for other uses. And you need only think about vaccination. Like, is there going to be some big database where people are known to be vaccinated and that this creates, is connected to some app on your phone? I don't know. I mean, but there's a lot of stuff that went digital during the pandemic and will remain digital. And so these are all debates that are coming for sure.
And in your opinion, John, how far are we in Toronto from living in a futuristic, complete smart city?
It's an evolution, right? And this is a long evolution compared to 20 years ago. I mean, the city can do things that it never conceived of being able to do. My view is that Toronto likes to talk about itself as very tech forward. I think as a city, we're sort of more cautious about some of these things than other places. And I think that's okay. I'm comfortable with caution because technologies can really alter the way people live and move in a city.
Thank you so much for your insights and your time, John. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
That was John Lorinc, the Star's Atkinson Fellow and Senior Editor for Spacing Magazine. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Sabai Tazaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Murter. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So-Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.